There is a new museum opening this week in our city, and I think it's a very, very important museum, and that its opening is a remarkable achievement. And to gain some perspective, I want to talk about the Parsha, which I think helps us understand the importance of the museum. As I mentioned when I was speaking to Isaac, the book of Bamidbar, which we began 2 weeks ago, Shavuot interrupted, is about counting, starts with accounting. That's why the English translation of Bamidbar is not wilderness, but numbers. And in this week's Parsha, we continue with the counting of the people, but specifically the Levitical tribe. Levi was one of the 12 tribes, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. His sons were Gershon, Kehat, and Merari. And Levi had a daughter called Yocheved. Yocheved was the mother of, she never gets credit, but she's the mother of Miriam, the mother of Moses, and the mother of Aaron. And Yocheved's 3 brothers fathered the constituent families of the tribe of Levi. And you know that eventually the Levites were set apart from the rest of the people, dedicated to the temple, to the tabernacle, and its service. Throughout the 40-year sojourn in the desert, the 3 Levitical families were charged with the mission of carrying the tabernacle and its accessories. The Kehatites, the first family, carried the holiest items, the ark, the ark, the candelabra, the table, the altars, and the utensils, all the special holy stuff that was used in the inside. Then you had the Gershonites. They were carrying the coverings and the curtains. And then the Merarites were carrying the planks, the bars, the pillars, and the sockets of the tabernacle structure. If you follow closely the reading, you see that the language used to command the count for the 3 Levitical families is slightly different each time. The first commandment from God to Moses to count the Kehatite family reads, Naso et rosh b'nei Kehat mitoch b'nei Levi lemishpechotam leveit avotam. Make a count of the sons of Kehat from among the children of Levi by their families according to their fathers' houses. The second, Naso et rosh b'nei Gershon gam heim leveit avotam lemishpechotam. Take a census of the sons of Gershon, of them too, following their fathers' houses according to their families. Then you have the third time, B'nei Merari lemishpechotam leveit avotam tifkod otam. Here, the word Naso, lift up, isn't even used. It says, of the sons of Merari, you shall count them by their families according to their fathers' houses. Not only do we find a difference in the lack of the word Naso when it comes to the last tribe, Gershon, the word tifkod is used, which is just the plain word for counting, but also in the first 2 commandments for the first 2 families, the words gam heim are added the second time. Count them too. The second family. Why them too? It almost makes it seem like they're less important than the first of the Levitical families. So consider the insight that I want to share with you today by one of the most renowned rabbis of the 19th century, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, was known as the Chatam Sofer. Chatam Sofer lived in Pressburg, which is today in Bratislava, was born in 1762, became the head of the yeshiva there, and died in 1839. He died about a century before the Holocaust, but I think that his insight is hauntingly relevant to the generation of our parents and grandparents, victims and survivors of the Holocaust. Pay attention to what he says. He said the Levitical tribe is representative of the Jewish people as a whole. That's why they had to take their census separately, privately from everybody else. And the names and the functions of the three Levitical families, Gershon, Kehat, and Merari, can be understood as alluding to three different phases of Jewish history. How so? Well, the names of these families hint at different circumstances. Kehat, from the word leket, means gathering. Gershon, related to the word gerush, expulsion. And Merari, related to the Hebrew word mar, meaning bitter, like at Pesach you eat maror. Let's start with Kehat, gathering. The family charged with the carrying of the holiest vessels of the tabernacle. Kehat, he said, represents the Jewish people at their most idealized state, unified and gathered in their own homeland, integrated and linked by a shared geographical and spiritual identity. When the census and mission of Kehat is introduced in the Torah, it's unsurprising that we find the word Naso, lift them up, because this represents the most elevated state of our people. But Jewish history, of course, was not just one long glow. And we have another family, the Gershonites, expulsion. Gershon symbolizes the era when the Jewish people were banished from their homeland and separated from God. The temple no longer standing. Yet even in exile, Jews gathered to expound and study the Torah. They created the synagogue. So despite physical expulsion and military defeat and loss of political sovereignty, our people succeeded in keeping the link alive. When the Torah says, Naso et rosh b'nei Gershon gam hem, count them too, it's implying, according to the Khatam Sofer, that even in a state of exile, if it is properly contended with, and if a link to the Torah is preserved, the Gershonites can also be elevated to the state and consciousness of earlier generations, just as if they were still at home, just like Kehat. Kehat, in our homeland, can be great and powerful and elevated, and even outside of our homeland, Gershon can be elevated too. But there was a third phase in Jewish history. The Khatam Sofer says this 100 years before the Holocaust. A third phase, too painful to address, but one experienced by our people 80 years ago. This is Merari, the times that were the most bitter, the times when the Jewish people were at their lowest, not only banished, but hunted down. From Pharaoh to Antiochus, through the cruel fist of Roman persecution, crusades, inquisitions, massacres, pogroms, Soviet oppression, the Nazi Holocaust, even Islamist wars and terror today. Merari symbolizes the bitterest, most painful moments in our story when our foes aspired to put an end to the Jewish people and to our faith. When it comes to Merari, there is no uplifting introduction. The word Naso is absent. Why? Says the Khatam Sofer. It is not because of any shame. He writes, these Jews are infinitely higher than their fathers. They don't need to be uplifted. They cannot reach any higher. These are the Jews who have drunk from the cup of bitterness and, despite it, have remained loyal to their faith and heritage. They are the greatest and holiest of all. The Bnei Merari, instead of witnessing the Exodus, they witnessed Auschwitz. Instead of the splitting of the sea, they endured Treblinka. Instead of manna from heaven, they lived through Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Mauthausen. As such, they are the holiest of the holy, the sanctity of the greatest scholars, and the most pious Jews cannot be compared to them. There is an interesting story about one of the great Jewish sages of the 20th century, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, when he once went to a doctor's visit near his home in the Catskills. It's told by a young Dr. Isaac Hershkopf. He's currently a psychiatrist at NYU. When he was younger, he was spending time with his aunt and uncle in that same town in the Catskills, which is in upstate New York, called Ellenville. His aunt and his uncle were survivors of the Holocaust. They had been in Auschwitz and they had tattoos on their arms. After the war, they set up a medical practice in this small Catskill village. And they had one celebrity patient, Rav Moshe Feinstein, well known in the Torah world for being, you could say, the leader of diaspora Orthodox Jewry in the 20th century. It happened to be that during the week that young Isaac was visiting his aunt and uncle, Dr. Moshe Feinstein had a medical appointment. And his aunt and uncle said, would you like to meet him? So this is what he writes. I was seated in the waiting room in the best clothing that I had with me. I came an hour before his appointment. It seemed like an eternity. But eventually, Rav Moshe arrived, accompanied by an assistant at each side. He didn't notice me. I was frozen. I had intended to rise deferentially when he entered, but I didn't. I had prepared a few sentences that I had repeatedly memorized, but I sensed that my heart was beating too quickly for me to speak calmly. My aunt had heard the chime when he entered and came out of the office to greet him. Rabbi Feinstein, did you meet my nephew Ike? Can you believe a shegitz like me has a yeshiva bacher in the family? Rav Moshe finally looked at me. I was mortified. My aunt was addressing him irreverently. She was joking with him. She had called me Ike, not Yitzchak or even Isaac. Then it got even worse. She walked over to him. Surely she knew not to shake his hand. She didn't. She kissed him affectionately on the cheek, as she did many of her favorite patients. She then told him my uncle would see him in a minute and returned to the office. My Rav Moshe and his attendants turned and looked at me. I thought accusingly. I wanted to die. In a panic, I walked over to him and started to apologize profusely. Rabbi Feinstein, I apologize. My aunt, she isn't frum, she's not religious, she doesn't understand. He immediately placed his fingers on my lips to stop me from talking. He then softly spoke 2 sentences in Yiddish that I will remember to my dying day. She has numbers on her arms. She is holier than me. Rav Moshe had understood what the Chatam Sofer was teaching about the Bnei Merari. The holiest generation is the generation that experienced the most bitter of times, but did not succumb to death and despair. Now, not every generation gets the chance to meet such people. Not every generation gets to call them neighbors, but we did. And we should feel grateful for the privilege and humbled by the burden it places on us. This week, on June the 9th, a magnificent new museum is opening to the public in our city called the Toronto Holocaust Museum. The museum is located on the Sherman campus, Bathurst and Shepherd. It is an outstanding and state-of-the-art facility with spaces for education and dialogue about the Holocaust and its ongoing relevance. It is an extraordinary collection. Now, some have questioned the need for another Holocaust museum. Why should Toronto bother? There are beautiful memorials already in New York, in DC, in Jerusalem. Here's my answer. I think that here in Toronto, and remember, I'm not from here, but I know that here in Toronto, in the years following the Shoah, lived the holiest Jews of any generation. The Chatam Sofer's Bnei Merari, in the flesh, and they became the backbone of the Canadian Jewish community's spiritual and physical foundation. With their very existence, they inspired us in extraordinary ways. They built this synagogue and many others in this city because they were determined to open a new chapter in their turbulent lives, to build families, to create memories, to construct successful lives. And they taught us all how we can uplift ourselves under all circumstances and kindle a flame of hope and love and faith. These were people who managed to find love in their hearts, hearts which observed endless hate and cruelty. These were people who managed to still believe in the promise of human dignity and majesty when they saw what humans were capable of. Though very few of these survivors remain, this museum is a giant statement that we, still today, are humbled by them, and we pay tribute to them, and we take upon ourselves the obligation to honor their stories in every way that we can. Naso, what are the things that we lift up and elevate in our lives? How do we see ourselves in relationships to our past and our heritage? In the span of Jewish history, we ought to melt in awe and reverence before the accomplishments of our own Bnei Merari. They carried the sanctuary of our Jewish heritage on their backs, and they brought us forward to reach all the blessings of today. You want to know why we have this museum? That's why we have it. And I want to congratulate everyone who helped make it possible. I hope everyone will have the chance to visit. May the stories and the memories enshrined therein abide for us always as eternal blessings. Shabbat Shalom.